Let's get started. Story number 1.
The plan was simple. 3 days deep in the Montana backcountry, camping in the snow. Jake, his younger brother Ryan, and their friend Eric had done winter hikes before, but this was their first time camping in a full-blown snowstorm. The forecast warned of heavy snowfall, but it was supposed to clear up by the second day. They figured they could handle it. By the time they hiked 6 miles into the woods, the sky was already darkening. Snow fell thick and heavy, muffling all sound except for the crunch of their boots. "This was a bad idea," Ryan muttered, pulling his scarf up over his face. "We'll be fine," Jake reassured him. "We just need to set up camp and get a fire going." They found a clearing near a frozen creek and pitched their tents quickly, hands numb despite their gloves. The storm was worsening, the wind cutting through the trees like a whispering voice. Once they got the fire going, the world felt a little less hostile. They ate their food, huddled close to the flames, and talked about anything other than the cold. Then came the first sound, distant, carried on the wind, a voice. Faint, ragged. "Help me." The three of them froze. "You hear that?" Eric whispered. Ryan swallowed hard. "It's probably the wind." Then it came again, closer. "Please, help." Jake grabbed his flashlight and stood. "Someone might be lost." Eric hesitated. "No one else is out here, man." But Jake was already moving toward the trees, scanning the darkness beyond their campsite. The snow made it impossible to see far, but he swore he saw something, a figure standing just beyond the fire's glow. "Hello," he called out. Silence. Then the wind shifted and the figure was gone. Jake turned back, his skin crawling. No footprints. Ryan shook his head. "We're in the middle of a storm. Tracks get covered fast." They tried to brush it off, but an unease settled over them. The wind felt colder, the dark deeper. That night, Jake woke up to a noise. Something was outside their tents. Not the wind, a crunch, slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow. He held his breath, his heart hammering. Then, a whisper. Right outside his tent, "Let me in." Jake shot upright, his breath frozen in his chest. The zipper of his tent shifted, not from the wind, from fingers. He grabbed his knife, ready to slash at anything that came inside. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. The footsteps retreated. Morning came, but none of them spoke about the night before. They packed up and left, hiking back as fast as they could. At the trailhead, Ryan stopped and turned back, his face pale. "There's only 3 sets of footprints." Eric frowned. "Yeah, ours." Ryan shook his head. "No, ours are deep from walking the whole way. But there's another set, smaller, barefoot, following us." Jake didn't turn around. They never spoke about it again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow had started falling early in the afternoon, but by the time they reached the campsite, the light flurries had turned into thick, blinding sheets. Jake, Eric, and Matt had planned this trip for months. A winter camping experience deep in the Rockies, far from any towns or roads. They weren't beginners. They had the right gear, the right supplies, and enough experience to handle the elements. But no one expected the storm to hit this hard. "Should we turn back?" Eric asked, adjusting his heavy pack. His breath came in thick clouds in the freezing air. "We're too far in now," Jake said, pulling his hat down tighter. "Besides, the forecast said it would die down overnight. We just need to set up camp and ride it out." Matt said nothing. He had been quiet since they left the truck miles back. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the eerie silence of the snow-covered forest around them. They finally reached a clearing near the edge of a frozen lake, just as the last of the daylight disappeared. Working quickly, they pitched their tents and started a fire. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches like skeletal fingers. "This place is creepy as hell," Eric muttered, rubbing his hands together. Jake smirked. "That's what makes it an adventure." The three of them ate their food quickly, warming themselves by the fire, but the cold gnawed at them relentlessly. The wind grew stronger, the storm swirling around them, making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. Then, beneath the howl of the wind, something else. A voice. Distant. Faint. "Help?" Jake looked up. "Did you hear that?" Eric frowned. "I thought it was just the wind." Matt, who had been staring into the fire, suddenly looked up. "No, that was someone." They listened. The wind screamed through the trees, snow whipping around them. Then, again, "Please, help me." It was barely audible, but it was there. A strained, breathy voice carried on the wind. "Shit," Jake muttered. "What if someone's lost out here?" No one else is supposed to be out here, Eric said, his voice tight. We didn't see any other tracks. The voice came again, closer. Help me. Matt stood up. We have to check. Jake hesitated. Something about it didn't feel right. The voice sounded wrong, too slow, too stretched, as if it was struggling to form words. Eric shook his head. No way. You don't go wandering in a whiteout. That's how people die. But Matt was already moving toward the trees, flashlight in hand. Damn it, Jake muttered, grabbing his own light and following. The snow was deep, making every step a struggle. The beams from their flashlights barely cut through the swirling white. Hello? Matt called. Where are you? Silence, then footsteps, crunching in the snow somewhere ahead. Jake swung his light in the direction of the sound. Nothing, no tracks, no movement, just endless white. Then the voice again, only this time it was behind them. Help me. Jake's stomach clenched. That was impossible. They had been heading toward the voice. How could it suddenly be behind them? Matt turned, his breath coming fast. We need to go back. They spun around, but the campsite was gone. The storm had erased everything. Panic tightened Jake's throat. The wind was deafening now, but beneath it the voice whispered again, closer than ever. Please, help. Eric grabbed Jake's arm. Run. They stumbled through the snow, blinded by the storm, heartbeats hammering in their ears. The voice followed, now overlapping, 2, 3 voices whispering the same plea. Then Jake saw it, a shape in the snow, pale, human-like, motionless. His flashlight flickered as it passed over the figure, and then it moved. Not like a person, jerky, unnatural. Its head snapped up, dark hollows where its eyes should have been. Jake didn't think. He ran. They crashed through the snow, half blind, lungs burning. The whispers were everywhere now, circling them, closing in. Then, suddenly, light. The fire. They stumbled into the campsite, gasping, collapsing onto the ground. The voices stopped, the wind still howled. But the presence, whatever it was gone. No one spoke. They didn't sleep. They just sat by the fire, waiting for morning. At first light, they packed up and left without a word. As they hiked back, Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time. At the edge of the clearing, half buried in the snow, were footprints. Bare. Human. Leading in circles around their camp. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm was supposed to pass by midnight. That's what the weather report said. It was the only reason Mark, Danny, and Jake decided to go ahead with their winter camping trip in the first place. They weren't amateurs. They had all the right gear, knew how to handle the cold, and had done winter trips before. But something about this trip felt different. The 3 of them had driven deep into the Montana wilderness, far from any roads or cabins, to set up camp near an old, abandoned fire lookout. It was just a half-day hike from where they left the truck, and they figured the high ground would offer some protection from the wind. When they reached the clearing and set up camp, the sky was clear, the snow thick beneath their boots, and the air biting cold. This place is kind of creepy, Danny muttered, glancing up at the fire tower. The old wooden structure loomed above them, its windows dark, its ladder broken and covered in frost. The place hadn't been used in decades, but they had heard stories. Rumors of a ranger who had gone missing up there during a blizzard in the 1960s. They never found his body. It's just an old watchtower, Mark said, brushing off the unease. Let's get the fire going. By the time night fell, the storm had rolled in fast, faster than the forecast had predicted. The wind howled through the trees, thick snow swirling around them, limiting visibility to just a few feet beyond the flickering firelight. Their tents, pitched close together for warmth, flapped violently in the wind. This is worse than I thought it'd be, Jake admitted, rubbing his hands together near the fire. Danny nodded. We should have brought more firewood. Mark frowned. We should have brought a damn cabin. They laughed, but it was uneasy. The wind screamed through the trees like something alive, something furious. Then, through the gusts, a sound carried on the wind, a voice. It was faint, distant, just barely audible beneath the storm's fury. Help. All 3 of them froze. Danny was the first to speak. Did you hear that? Mark swallowed hard. Yeah. Jake stood up, turning his head toward the sound. Could be another camper. No one else is out here, Danny said. We would have seen them on the way up. The voice came again, a little clearer now. Please, help me. It was coming from the trees beyond their tents. Jake grabbed his flashlight. Someone's out there. Danny caught his arm. Wait. Think about it. Who the hell would be out here in this storm? Mark stood up, brushing the snow off his jacket. If someone's lost, we can't just leave them. The three of them exchanged uneasy glances before pulling on their heavy coats and gloves. The wind was brutal as they stepped away from the fire, the light from their flashlights barely cutting through the whiteout conditions. "Hello?" Mark called. No answer. "Help!" It was closer now. They followed the sound into the trees, their boots crunching over deep snow. The air was so cold it burned their lungs. Then Jake saw something. A figure. A man, barely visible through the thick snowfall. He was standing completely still between the trees, his clothes thin, his face pale. His eyes were dark hollows. Danny cursed under his breath. "Jesus!" Mark stepped forward. "Hey, you okay? What the hell are you doing out here dressed like that?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at them. Jake's grip tightened on the flashlight. "We should go back." The man's lips moved, but his voice came from behind them. "Help me." Jake whipped around, his heart hammering. The voice was right behind them, but the man was still in front of them. The air felt wrong. Wrong. Thick. Heavy. Danny took a step back. "Guys, run." No one needed convincing. They turned and bolted back toward the fire, stumbling through the deep snow, breath ragged. The moment they burst into the clearing, the wind seemed to die down for just a second. Then something moved. The tents. They weren't as they had left them. The zippers were undone, the fabric was torn, and something had disturbed the snow around them. Deep, erratic footprints, too large and too far apart to be human. "What the hell?" Mark started, but then the wind screamed again. And this time they all heard it, a laugh. Low, guttural, and echoing. It came from the fire tower. Jake's flashlight swung toward it. Something was up there, a shape in the window. Watching. Danny grabbed his backpack. "Nope, we're leaving. Now." They didn't even bother packing their tents. They just grabbed what they could and ran. The hike back to the truck was brutal. The storm fought them every step of the way, and more than once, Jake swore he saw something moving just beyond the trees. A shadow, slipping between the trunks. They didn't stop. Not until they reached the truck, where they threw their gear inside and peeled out of there, driving through the storm without looking back. No one spoke the whole way home. Weeks later, Jake looked up the old fire tower online. He found an old article, one that confirmed the story of the missing ranger. But there was something else, something he hadn't heard before. The ranger wasn't the only one who had gone missing up there. Over the years, other campers had disappeared in the same area. Some were never found. And those who made it back, they all reported the same thing. A voice, a whisper in the wind, and a figure in the snow. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm had come faster than the forecast predicted. Jake and his two best friends, Eric and Sam, had planned this winter camping trip for months. They wanted an adventure, something beyond the usual cabin stays and resort getaways. They wanted to challenge themselves, to prove they could endure the raw, untamed wilderness. They had chosen a remote spot deep in the Montana backcountry, miles from civilization. The plan was to set up their tents, build a fire, and enjoy the beauty of the winter landscape. But by the time the first flakes started falling, the wind had already picked up, howling through the dense pine trees like a pack of unseen predators. "We need to set up camp now," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the wind. The three men worked quickly, their breath coming in thick clouds as they hammered tent stakes into the frozen ground. The cold was relentless, biting through their gloves and thick jackets. The storm intensified within the hour, and soon visibility dropped to just a few feet. Inside their tents, huddled in sleeping bags, they listened to the wind rage outside. "Damn, this storm's brutal," Eric muttered. Sam chuckled, though there was unease in his voice. "Maybe we should have booked a cabin after all." Jake smirked, but said nothing. He liked the challenge. But as the wind howled louder, another sound cut through, something distinct, separate from the storm. A faint, rhythmic crunching like footsteps in the snow. They all heard it. "You hear that?" Sam whispered. Eric nodded, his expression unreadable. Probably just a deer or something, but the crunching stopped. Then, after a long pause, it resumed, closer this time. Jake unzipped the tent flap and peered out, but the swirling snow obscured everything beyond a few feet. He turned back inside, shaking his head. "I don't see anything." No one spoke for a long while. They eventually fell asleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Sometime in the middle of the night, Jake woke up. The storm was still raging, but something felt off. Then he heard it again, the crunching of snow, slow, deliberate. Jake held his breath. It wasn't the storm. Something or someone was out there. He nudged Eric awake. "Hey, listen." Eric sat up groggily, but his eyes widened when he heard it. Sam stirred awake too, his expression tense. Then, as if sensing they were listening, the footsteps stopped right outside their tent. Jake's heart pounded. The fabric of the tent was thin. Whatever was out there was just inches away. Then came a sound that sent ice through his veins. A low whisper, ragged, breathy. "Let me in." Sam clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from gasping. Eric's face had gone pale. Jake swallowed hard. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then, another whisper, this time from a different direction. "Let me in." It was coming from Eric's side now. "Nope. Nope. I'm not doing this," Sam whispered, his voice barely steady. Then the tent shook. Not from the wind, but from something pressing against it. A long, slow drag, like a hand tracing along the fabric. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The three of them sat frozen in silence. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them and they fell into uneasy sleep. Morning came, and with it, an eerie stillness. The storm had passed. When they emerged from the tent, the ground around them was covered in fresh snow, except for the footprints. They were everywhere. Not deer tracks, not bear prints. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. The three men exchanged horrified looks. No sane person would be out here barefoot in a snowstorm. And then Jake noticed something else. The footprints didn't just stop at their tent. They circled it. Again and again. The men didn't waste time. They packed up and left, trudging through the deep snow as fast as they could. They never spoke about it again. But each of them, in their own way, knew the truth. Something had been out there with them, and it had wanted in. Story the end.